Hi everyone, welcome to this week's online causal inference seminar. Let me share it. So today we are excited to host a young researcher seminar where we feature two young researchers. So our first speaker will be Julius von Kügelgen from ETH Zurich. He will be talking about multi-domain causal representation learning. And in the Q&A, we have the collaborator Luigi Grazel to handle some of the questions. And for the second half, our speaker is David Brown-Smith from Stanford University, and he'll be talking about augmented balancing weights as linear regression. Today's Q&A will be handled by Qingyuan. Do you want to?
Yes. Yeah, so basically it's very simple. Just use the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen and submit your questions there. So this will allow us to keep track of the questions, and it will also allow Luigi to answer those questions. And we only sort of bring the most interesting questions for the open discussion later with the speaker. And that's pretty much it. Without further ado, Julius, you want to take it away?
Sure. Yeah, so hello everyone. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I will talk today about multi-domain causal representation learning. Okay, so my talk will be based on these two papers here. And I want to start by just acknowledging my wonderful co-authors in these works. So that's Liang Wendong, Armin Kekic, Simon Buchholz, Michel Besserve, Luigi Gresele, who was instrumental in the first paper and who's also here today to answer your questions in the chat. And then Bernhard Schürkopf, Elias Barenboim, and David Bly. So there'll be roughly 3 parts. I'll start by giving an overview of the shared problem setting and some background, and then we'll get into the details of these 2 different studies. So in causal representation learning, the problem that we mean is, or the sort of data generating process that we typically assume is the one illustrated here, where we have some observations, X, typically very high dimensional. And that could be, for example, images or many, many pixels. And the idea is that these observations are in turn generated by some measurement process or a mixing function f applied to a typically smaller number of abstract causal variables that are here denoted Z1 up to Zn. And the goal is then, given only observations of X, how can we recover these latent causal variables and the causal graph that encodes their relations? Now, you can think of this, this problem as a generalization of independent component analysis, or ICA, which corresponds to the special case where the causal graph G is assumed to be the empty graph. And as in ICA, and even more so for this more general problem here, the problem is very highly non-unique. So that means that we can have many different generative processes that give rise to the same observed distributions. And as a result, we say that the model class is not identifiable. And identifiability, so this ability to provably recover parts of the generative process, that's going to be the main topic of the talk today. And there have been, of course, some or many previous works that try to study this or that study this problem. And I wanted to start by giving an overview of some of the different assumptions that people have explored in the literature. So first up is this sort of purely unsupervised setting where we learn from IID data. And in causal terms, we would think of that as observational data. And here to make progress, it's typically necessary to impose some restrictions on both the graph as well as to impose some parametric assumptions on the causal model and the measurement process. Then there is the multi-domain setting, which I will also talk about today. And there we have access to multiple data sets that are typically not identically distributed. And usually, as we'll see, this is formalized in interventional terms. And here, whereas one can consider arbitrary graphs, most previous works have focused on parametric settings as well. Then there's the multi-view scenario, where we have access to pairs or tuples of non-independent observations. And this is often treated as counterfactual data. And so with this very rich information, it's possible to make progress both for arbitrary graphs and arbitrary non-parametric models. And lastly, the temporal case also typically falls between the observational and interventional settings and considers different types of non-IID data, depending, for example, on non-stationarity and autocorrelation assumptions. So as I said, today I want to focus on this multi-domain scenario and specifically on generalizing or extending previous results to the non-parametric case. So just to give an idea of what I mean by this multi-domain data, here the idea is that our data sets are collected from different environments or different domains. And for example, our data might take the form, as seen here, of images of tissue samples, and different domains could correspond to different hospitals. And so this data is quite abundant, and we've seen, or we know from other literature, that it may provide some useful learning signals for causal inference. And so it's sort of natural to also pursue this setting in a causal representation learning context. Now, of course, the use of having access to multiple data sets or multiple domains is somehow the implicit assumption that they're not completely unrelated, but that they share certain aspects. Otherwise, we could just analyze each of them in isolation. So instead, we assume that actually these domains all share the same underlying causal model and also the same measurement process. And the only differences across domains are the result of interventions on subsets of the nodes. So that setting is visualized here in the center of the slide, where we have 4 different domains. The very left one is an observational one, and then we have 3 domains corresponding to interventions on nodes 1, 2, and 3, as shown by these hammer symbols. And more formally and more generally, we assume that for each domain, our measurements x are the result of the same mixing function f applied to our latent vector z. And the distribution of z in each environment is an interventional distribution from the same causal model, where the subset of variables specified by this set of intervention targets, calligraphic IE, is potentially perturbed. Could be a stochastic intervention, could be an imperfect one. We'll see more on that later. And all the other parts of the model are shared across domains, so these unintervened or base causal mechanisms. Okay, so that's sort of the data generating process that we will assume throughout. And I've already alluded to the fact that there have been other studies in this scenario, and I won't go into detail, but just to highlight, mostly they place some assumptions on either the mixing function or on the causal model. For example, assuming that this is linear or some simple parametric form makes it a lot easier to study and to prove identifiability. And here we want to focus on the case in which both the mixing function and the causal model are unconstrained. And of course, we need some technical assumptions. So just for completeness, these are that for the mixing function, we assume that it is a diffeomorphism, meaning roughly that it's sort of invertible and sufficiently smooth. And we also assume that all densities are continuously differentiable and fully supported, but no further sort of parametric form assumed. Now, the first setting that we considered was basically motivated by trying to make the problem a little bit easier by asking first, what can we actually do if we know the causal graph? And we named this problem causal component analysis. And we can think of it as an intermediate problem between ICA and causal representation learning, in the sense that similar to ICA, we also assume that the graph is known. But just as in causal representation learning, this known graph need not be the empty graph, right? So there might be some edges, some causal relationships amongst the latent variables that we're interested in. So as a generalization of the ICA setting, we can transfer any positive results to also give us new results for ICA as a special case. And at the same time, any negative results or fundamental limitations that we already encounter for this scenario where the graph is known will also, of course, be limitations for the more general case where the graph is not known. So we start with this intermediate problem here. Now, one of the main challenges is to identifiability is the existence of spurious solutions. So spurious solutions roughly means that we have different models or different generative processes which generate the same observed distributions, but which are not related to each other in simple terms. So here, usually what we're looking for is identification up to an element-wise reparameterization of the variables, right? So we want a one-to-one correspondence between the learned and the true variables. And if this is not the case, we will refer to a solution as spurious. And in the multi-domain setting that we're studying, the learning signal comes from these distribution changes that result from interventions. And it turns out that these interventions actually need to be relatively powerful. So specifically, they need to change the unintervened distribution almost everywhere. And the reason for that is visualized here on the slide. So what happens if the intervened and the observational distribution are actually the same in some region of the domain? So here in the picture on the left, let's say the blue one is the intervention distribution and the green one is the observational distribution. And they're constructed such that within the red region, they overlap or they coincide. Then what we can do is we can construct this solution on the right plot. So the middle one being, let's say, the ground truth. And on the right, we can, within this red region, apply a measure-preserving transformation, which mixes the variables, but does not change the distribution. So this can, for example, be done by mapping to a Gaussian, then applying a rotation, and then mapping back. So this will give the same distribution, but it will introduce some mixing between the variables. And we can always do this unless we make this interventional discrepancy assumption, which states that take any pair of unintervened and intervened densities, then the gradient of their ratio needs to be non-zero almost everywhere. So formally, that's sort of encoding this notion that the intervention is sufficiently strong. Okay, so with this assumption, and that's sort of the key assumption, and another very important assumption is that we will assume that the intervention targets are known. And we then consider different combinations of perfect or imperfect and of single or multi-node interventions, and provide a whole suite of different identifiability results. And I won't have time to cover them in any detail, but just to give like a vague idea, if we have one perfect intervention per node, then we can achieve the strongest type of identifiability, this sort of one-to-one element-wise reparameterization. That's the second row here highlighted in green. And also consistent with prior results, if we have one intervention per node, but this intervention is imperfect, meaning that it doesn't completely break the dependence on the causal parents, then we can only identify variables up to a mixing with their causal ancestors. Now, as I mentioned, we can also look at ICA as a special case and in fact gain some new insights or some new results here. And again, I just want to sort of summarize the main takeaway here is that by formalizing distribution shifts through interventions, rather than talking about a shift in the entire joint distribution, as is usually done in ICA, we gain efficiency in terms of the number of domains needed. So if we compare the last two rows here, we see that we only need 3 environments in total if we have single node interventions versus 7 environments if the interventions are sort of changing all of the joint distribution. Okay, and so basically this localized interventional nature of distribution changes gets us that additional learning signal to get away with fewer domains. And so therefore this perspective might even be interesting if you're just looking at ICA scenarios where your variables are independent. And we also formally show that identifiability, or at least this sort of element-wise identifiability is not possible if any of these assumptions here are violated. So I already discussed the interventional discrepancy assumption, but also we find that if there's any variable that isn't intervened upon in the general case or in the independent case, two variables or more that are not intervened upon, then the problem is not possible to solve. And so therefore these assumptions kind of also show us the limits of what we definitely need, especially now moving beyond the causal component analysis setting to the scenario of causal representation learning, where the graph is also unknown. Before we get there, I want to just briefly highlight one of our experimental findings. So here we simulated some data and we then trained a model to sort of estimate the ground truth variables. And what we did here specifically is a maximum likelihood approach where we fit a normalizing flow to this multi-domain data. And the normalizing flow, the key difference to a vanilla flow is that the base distribution is now structured according to the causal graph. And some of the mechanisms that are not intervened upon are shared between domains. And if we then fit this type of model to the data and evaluate the similarity between the inferred representation and the ground truth, that's quantified here by the mean correlation coefficient, or MCC, on the y-axis, then we find that as expected, our method is performing or recovering the true variables very accurately, even as the strength of causal relationships on the x-axis is increased. Right? So whereas the ICA baseline in yellow still performs well if the causal relationships are weak, but as we increase the strength of causal influence, the sort of misspecified model breaks down, which of course is the expected behavior here. So it's more just a sort of sanity check that indeed this is helpful and necessary if you have causal relationships to encode them in order to accurately recover the underlying concepts. Okay, now moving on to the causal representation learning setting, just to refresh again what we have, what we're talking about. We see on the left here the unknown generative process. And now we also need to learn the graph and the intervention targets. So that's why on the right of this plot, you see that we not only have an encoder, which maps to representation, but we also have this candidate graph G prime, which tells us how to factorize this encoded distribution. And we also need to learn the intervention targets. And so in principle, they might not align with the intervention targets in the true generative process on the left. And now we will focus. So this problem is, of course, a lot harder. There's more things sort of that are unknown, more things to be learned. And we will therefore focus here mostly on this bivariate setting. And we'll also consider the arguably unrealistic case of single node perfect interventions. So where the interventions completely remove the influence on the parents. since there's more elements to be learned, in particular, we also need to learn the graph now. Let's define the equivalence class or the type of identifiability that we're actually after. And so here what we say is that two solutions or two models consisting of an encoder H and a graph G are equivalent or indistinguishable if and only if they are related by a graph isomorphism. So that's a permutation of the nodes, which leaves the edges unchanged, and an element-wise rescaling that we already saw before. And so this equivalence class generalizes the similar or the analogous equivalence class for ICA, which is recovered if the graph is empty, then we can sort of get arbitrary permutation indetermination. And what's also good just to check is that this equivalence notion is minimal in the sense that this is really the best we can hope for, in the sense that we can always find another solution within the equivalence class which exhibits equally sparse interventions. Now, maybe a natural first question is how good is this type of identifiability actually? So what use is it in the end? So for example, due to this scale reparameterization, we clearly cannot interpret the absolute sizes of causal effects between different representations. But there are some quantities that are preserved or that are shared by all elements in the same equivalence class. And one example of such a quantity are these causal influences. So these are based on some work by Jansing and colleagues, where the notion or like the measure of causal influence of a node I on a node J is formalized in an information theoretic sense as a KL divergence between the unintervened distribution and another distribution which basically simulates an intervention on Zi. And we show that this measure of influence is preserved within our equivalence class, right? So specifically, if we take any other representation Z hat, which is related to the truth by some isomorphism and preparameterization, then the influences are invariant to the rescaling and they're equivariant to the permutations. And what this means in practice is that we can actually somehow interpret these representations that we end up learning across different domains and ascribe some meaning to these variables, which is important, for otherwise they're basically just numbers that we get out of our computer, and it's hard to really sort of interpret what's going on there. So hopefully that gives at least some justification that this is an interesting notion of identifiability to strive for. And now I want to discuss our main result in this context, which is to show that indeed this level of identifiability is feasible in the fully non-parametric setting from, again, an observational environment and one intervention per node. But crucially, there are some corner cases here that we need to rule out. And we do that through this genericity condition. So basically, we need to ask that some notion of no fine-tuning amongst the distributions is satisfied. And that's formalized by this condition that you see here, which basically asks that there exists some function phi, which you can think of as a witness function of genericity, such that these two expectations here, one with respect to the observation distribution, one with respect to the interventional distribution on Z1, are different. And this is probably a little bit hard to unpack. So just to maybe give one example, let's plug in some simple function like x squared. Then we get this expression here at the bottom of the screen. And the main thing you should take away from this is an expression that involves all of the unintervened and intervened densities, right? So the base and the intervened mechanisms. And in general, there's no reason to believe that this quantity should always be zero, right? And so it will only be zero for all such functions phi in like very non-generic corner cases. And so we think of this as a little bit similar in spirit to comparable conditions, for example, in cause-effect inference. So if you're familiar with the nonlinear additive noise model or the post-nonlinear model, there also sort of some corner cases need to be ruled out, and they're sort of characterized by the solutions to a system of differential equations. So one might think of this condition here as similarly characterizing or specifying these or ruling out these corner cases. Okay, so except for these very weird situations, this setting is identifiable from one intervention per node, even in the fully non-parametric case. And we also have some results for the setting of more than 2 nodes, but I think I will skip this in the interest of time, just to briefly mention here things we sort of make our life a little bit easier by asking that we have actually more than one intervention per node. And if we have like multiple such data sets, then things get a lot easier. And again, I just want to highlight one experimental finding. So for this bivariate case that we also discussed the main result for, here again we learned from 3 domains as required by the theory, an observational and 1 intervention per node. And what we now do is, since we also need to learn the graph and the intervention targets, in this case it's very simple. There's only 4 possibilities, so we just can enumerate all combinations. And once we fix the graph and the intervention targets, we're back in the causal component analysis setting. So we can run that approach, and then we can compare the different models. And that's what's shown here. So the correct one is shown in blue. So the correct graph and the correct choice of intervention targets. And on the right plot, we see the difference in log likelihood to this correct model for the other 3. And as we see, this difference is almost always larger than 0, which means that we can do model selection and based on the log likelihood correctly pick the right graph and the right targets. And if we then look at the MCC value in the left plot, we see that this correct model indeed recovers the true variables very accurately. Okay, so basically we can do model selection, and if we select the correct model, this model also recovers the truth faithfully. So to wrap up, just a few points I want to mention. One is this genericity condition. We could only characterize it in the bivariate setting. But that's not because we don't think the result would extend to larger n. It's just things get a little bit more tricky, and there's probably multiple such conditions. But we conjecture that also 1 intervention per node should be sufficient in that case. And then, of course, there are several other limiting assumptions that I made implicitly or explicitly, such as that the number of variables that we're looking for is known, which is not the case in practice, or that the mixing function is invertible, etc., etc. Also, our estimation procedure of just enumerating graphs and targets is not very scalable, of course. It's hard to do this for graphs with more than, let's say, 3 nodes or 4 nodes. So there's still lots of open problems, I would say. And indeed, this is like a very active area of research. If you're not so familiar with this field, there's been a lot of other interesting works around the same time or that have come out since that I encourage you to also check out. And so with that, let me conclude. So what I presented today was identifiability results for these 2 different problem settings, causal component analysis and causal representation learning. And in both cases, we leverage the learning signal that comes from interventional multi-domain data with a specific focus on the fully non-parametric case. And as we showed, even in this case where these mixing functions and causal mechanisms are essentially infinite dimensional objects, or they're completely unconstrained, we can still provably learn them just from interventional data if we have sufficiently rich interventions. And so under the right kind of conditions, this might be seen as justifying the use of like very expressive machine learning and deep learning tools to learn these complicated densities and functions. So I leave you with that. And if you're interested in more, I'm happy to answer questions. And you can find the papers on arXiv, and our code is also available on GitHub. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Julius, for the great talk. For the interest of the time and because the collaborator has been answering the question in the Q&A, we will just switch to David's talk. Feel free to take over, David.
Yes, and if you do have any questions from the audience, please submit it through the Q&A box. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.